Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. And this is the start of our new series running over the next couple of weeks, in which I'm going to be talking to the historian of British democracy, Robert Saunders, about 6 historic UK general elections, how they shaped modern Britain, and the ideas that lie behind them. What did they mean? Starting with the election of 1906, which is often held up as the greatest defeat in the Conservative Party's modern history. Until now. Robert, the 1906 election has come up a bit in 2024 because it is held up as the gold standard of Tory failure. It is, maybe until now, I think almost certainly until now, the worst result in the modern history of the Conservative Party, certainly in terms of seats won. 156 they ended up with. That's worse than 97, worse than 2001. It's a fascinating election and there's lots to talk about. But what does it mean to you if you just sort of had to sum up 1906? Because it has a lot of symbolic value as well as real political consequences, because it was the high watermark of liberalism too. What does 1906 mean to you as an election?
It's a really exciting election. So it's the last great Liberal landslide in which the Liberal Party steamrollers the Conservative Party in an election that turned out to be the last majority that the Liberals ever won. So in some respects, this is the last of the Victorian elections, and it's the last of those great contests between the Liberal Party and the Conservatives, where they're arguing about things like free trade and church reform. And yet it empowers one of the great reforming governments of the 20th century, which does things like introduces old age pensions, free school meals, maternity benefit, national health insurance, unemployment insurance. It's the first election at which the Labour Party really makes a splash, only 6 years old at the time, and it wins its first 29 MPs. So in all sorts of ways, it's an election that looks forward to the politics of the 20th century and that electrifies the public around big issues of Britain's trade relations with the world, its relations with its empire, the future of its national security. So hopefully there'll be lots for us to talk about.
Absolutely, and we're going to come on to the question, which is one of, I think, the interesting ones, which is, could in 1906 it be seen that this was going to be one of the great reforming administrations? But there are many differences with now. We don't want to overdo the parallels of 2024, but all the elections we're going to talk about have got fascinating echoes that come through to today. But one big difference here is that there was a Conservative government that had been elected in 1900 with a thumping majority, and that was Balfour's government, though Balfour wasn't the leader in 1900. It was still the dying days of Salisbury, the great dominant Conservative statesman of the end of the 19th century. But Balfour had resigned and stuck in his opponent, Campbell-Bannerman, and it was Campbell-Bannerman as Prime Minister who called the election. So the parallel now would be, and it doesn't make any sense, I don't think there's any scenario in which this happens, Rishi Sunak, rather than going to the country, goes to the palace and says to the king, right, I'm done, get Keir Starmer to form a government with his minority in the Commons and see how he gets on. What was the thinking behind that? So what was the strategic rationale for Balfour to stick in the Liberals? Because in a sense, they called his bluff. They just went straight to the country anyway.
I don't think it's so much a strategic decision as simply the utter disintegration of a party of government to an extent that we've never really seen in another parliament. So as you say, the Conservatives in 1900 had crushed the Liberals, had fought this great single-issue campaign on the patriotic issue of support for Britain and getting the Boers done in the South African War. They'd won this huge majority, and they proceeded to collapse so extraordinarily that they didn't even make it to the next general election. Over the next few years, there were Conservatives standing against each other in seats. There were Conservatives trying to drive one another out of Parliament. There were MPs crossing the floor. Famously, of course, a young Conservative called Winston Churchill crosses the floor and joins the Liberals. So by 1905, the Conservatives have almost become incapable of governing. And the last straw, really, that Balfour can tug on is the hope that if he puts the Liberals in, then their divisions will explode. Then all of the things that they disagree about in terms of Britain's imperial policy and its economic future will then frighten the public again in a way that might save the Conservatives at this election. But if it's a gamble in that respect, it's a spectacularly unsuccessful one.
And did he not really suspect that they might just call an election because within a month they go to the country?
Yes, I think he must have known that that was likely, but Balfour was in an almost impossible position. And it does take us back to what's unusual about this parliament, that it's not unusual for a government that's been in power for a long time to run out of steam.
Indeed.
Yes, this government doesn't run out of steam. What happens is that the party takes up a series of really radical and exciting new policy initiatives, which are either very unpopular with the electorate or are extremely divisive in their own party, in particular relating to tariffs, to migration. And those questions split the Conservative Party down the middle. So a party that's always been famous historically for its iron discipline suddenly turns into this sort of scene from Lord of the Flies.
And the symbol of the splits is the most charismatic Conservative politician of the age, Joseph Chamberlain, who is the advocate of tariff reform, which, we're going to have to talk this through to try and explain just why that was such a contentious issue and a divisive issue. Is it also fair to say that Chamberlain, to use a contemporary term, was advocating a form of populist conservatism?
Well, Chamberlain had started his career as a radical liberal. We have to remember that he had split a party before. So he had been the rising star of radical liberalism in the 1870s. The mayor of Birmingham came into Parliament as a Liberal MP and then broke with his leader over the issue of Home Rule for Ireland and the question of whether Ireland should have a parliament. And he had carried off a section of the Liberal Party, which became known as the Liberal Unionists, which aligned themselves with the Conservatives. So actually, when we talk about the Conservative Party in this period, we're really talking about two parties. There's the larger and more dominant Conservative Party, and then there are the Liberal Unionists, of whom Joe Chamberlain is the leading figure. But he's always a radical at heart. This isn't someone who's in politics to conserve things. This is someone who's in politics to bring out spectacular and explosive change. And what holds him to the Conservative Party is his enthusiasm for the empire. But he's not content with the empire as it is. He wants the empire as it could be in the 20th century.
And that means what was called imperial preference. So that means tariffs. It means protecting trade within the empire and putting big tariffs on imports from outside of the empire. And this is the central issue in the campaign. I mean, there are many, many things that were being argued about. The Liberal Party was the party of free trade. The Conservative Party was, and the Liberal Unionists were split on this question, but certainly the Liberals did a good job of tying Balfour to Chamberlain and portraying this as a choice between free trade and protection. Free trade was presented by the Liberals as for the benefit of the working man. Protection was presented by Chamberlain as for the benefit of the working man. How did those arguments go? I mean, how did they play out?
So it's hard, I think, to recapture today just how exciting the question of free trade and tariffs is in this period. But, this is an issue that brings 2 million more people out to vote in 1906 than in the previous general election. It produces the third highest turnout, I think, in the whole of the 20th century. Literally millions of pamphlets and leaflets are distributed around the country. There are cartoons, there are films, there are speeches. This is the big question of the day. And it's partly because of the almost religious status that free trade had. So Britain had been broadly a free trading nation since the 1840s. So you can import goods and export goods without tariffs, without any kind of barriers to trade. And that had come to be seen as not just the basis for Britain's prosperity, but the basis for almost everything else. It was the basis of its freedom. It was the basis of its democracy. It was the basis of its social peace. It was the thing that held its empire together. So to challenge free trade was to challenge, if you like, the central pillar of British history and identity for the last 80 years. Campbell-Bannerman, the Liberal leader, said disputing free trade is like disputing the law of gravity. So at a time when the Conservative Party was already beginning to tear itself apart because of the mismanagement of the Boer War and everything that came out of that, Joe Chamberlain, who's been the colonial secretary, resigns from the cabinet, makes a great speech in favour of what he calls tariff reform. and launches a crusade across the country. And he's almost like a kind of evangelical preacher traveling the country, drumming up support and trying to win over his own party to this incredible new policy departure.
And he's doing it in the name of the people of Birmingham, and Birmingham is an industrial centre. So this is also in the name of Britain's industrial power. So this is an industrialist policy. It's a state management policy. You might say it's a sort of state investment policy. We'll put tariffs on imports and we'll use the money to invest in local industry. So it's not, this is not the politics of the Corn Laws. We're doing this for the landed gentry so that they can keep food prices up. But the Liberals successfully, I think, nonetheless associate the policy of protection with food prices going up. I mean, isn't that where the contest turns?
Yes, in some ways there is a comparison here with an issue like Brexit. That when the country was debating Brexit, most of us weren't actually arguing about rules of origin or the common tariff barrier or the structures of the EU. What we were arguing about were other things like sovereignty or immigration or democracy or Britain's place in the world. And that's what happens here as well. That for Chamberlain, tariff reform is about as close as you can get to a universal remedy. So it's an economic policy because it's going to protect British industry, which is starting to be overhauled by Germany and the United States and other rising powers. But it's also an imperial policy. He argues that you can use this to bind the empire together by making sure that the colonies have lower tariffs than other parts of the world. It's also a welfare policy. He argues that the revenues that you raise from tariffs can be used for things like old age pensions or free school meals or help for children. It's a class policy, because it binds together the employer and the working man against their common enemy. It's a national security policy, because it makes sure that Britain's basic industries like shipbuilding, iron, steel, the things that you need as a military power, aren't undermined by other countries dumping their goods on your market and closing your industries down. So Chamberlain essentially says we're at a kind of inflection point in history where that long, unchallenged dominance of the British Empire is over, and we now have to face a world in which we're competing with great titans like America, Russia, and Germany. And for a new world, we need a new policy, and that has got to be tariff reform.
And as you say, another parallel here with Brexit actually is it's not just a high turnout election. It mobilizes parts of the electorate that hadn't been voting in the past. So this is not an enfranchisement election. I think something like 60% more people vote in this election than in the election of 1900. That's not because a chunk of the population have been enfranchised. The great reform acts of the late 19th century are done, and the next great enfranchisement reform is not coming till 1918. So this is a mobilization election, but it's a mobilization of parts of the electorate that hadn't been voting, in the same way that with Brexit, we know 3 or 4 million people turned out, in that case, who didn't normally vote in general elections, but they were mobilized by Brexit to come to the polls. In this case, the mobilization works for the Liberals. So whatever it is the Liberals are doing in this campaign, for all of Chamberlain's, I still think populism is a word for what you've just described, for all of Chamberlain's populism, and it works in Birmingham. I think he still holds on to all of his seats. The Tory Liberal Unionist Alliance holds on to Birmingham. But across the country, it is the Liberals who use this issue, and some other ones we'll come on to too, some obscure ones like Chinese slave labor in South Africa, to mobilize sections of the population that didn't normally vote. And I believe one of the differences between this election and 1900 is in 1900, the Tories won in part because a lot of seats were uncontested. And this becomes more like a modern election. We're going to fight you everywhere, and we are going to do what it takes to get the vote out. Like you say, posters, what might now be called a modern campaign.
Yes, so in 1906, more people voted than had ever voted at a British general election in history. And that's partly, as you say, because in 1900, the Liberal Party had been so divided, particularly over the Boer War, but also by the kind of succession crisis after Gladstone's death, that the Liberal Party couldn't even put up a candidate in about 150 constituencies. So that election had basically been lost before a single person had gone out to vote. But it's also because actually it really does mobilize the public, because whatever you care most about, whether it's the empire or whether it's your ability to feed your family next week or your chances of having a job in 2 weeks' time, all of those things get sucked down into the question of free trade. So it's an election that is actually fought across the country in a way that had been quite unusual in many recent campaigns.
So I mentioned Chinese slave labor, which is one of the slogans, Chinese slavery, I think it was called, which is one of the slogans of this campaign. So that one does go back to the Boer War and the aftermath of the Boer War. It connects to all sorts of other questions around the British Empire and how it was run. But just give us a sense of how that one became such a touchstone in this campaign as well.
Yeah, so what we've got in this period is a kind of quasi-democratic system in which you have a mass electorate and politicians are still trying to work out how you appeal to it, how you mobilize it. So there are lots of high-minded speeches about the future of trade, and then there are lots of extraordinarily demotic acts of pantomime, and Chinese slavery is one of them. So after the Boer War in South Africa, the British had wanted to get the gold and diamond mines up and running again as quickly as possible. But there was a severe labour shortage. So what they started to do was to import labour from China. Now, these were indentured labourers. They're not technically slaves, but they're on usually 3 or 4 year contracts, which they cannot break. They're subject to extraordinarily high levels of discipline. They are largely confined to barracks or compounds when they're not working, and their working conditions are very poor. And that becomes known as Chinese slavery, and it electrifies the British public. And it does so partly for high-minded reasons. This is the country that likes to think it led the world in abolishing slavery. But actually, it's much more about they were supposed to be our jobs. The British Empire is supposed to be there in order to benefit the British working man. And this is what the Tories want to do with the empire, is they want to fill it with cheap immigrant labour from overseas. So we get people like Lloyd George warning the country that there will be slavery in the mountains of Wales and that there will be Chinese slaves sent down the mines. And what you get in a lot of towns in particular is that actors are recruited to dress up as, in the terms of the time, Chinamen, who march through the streets in Chinese costume with manacles and irons on their legs as a warning that this is what the Tories are doing to your empire and that this is what Tories want to do to working conditions. And of course, if you're trying to tackle the claim made by Chamberlain that tariffs are going to mean better wages and better working conditions for the British working man, then being able to say, actually, it's about the Chinese working man is a really strong liberal rebuke to that.
It's a good example of the way in which this election both harks back as a slavery question, harking back to a set of debates that were at least 100 years old. It feels like it's a throwback to the 19th century. But as a cheap immigrant labour question, it feels like it throws forward to the 21st century. I mean, there are echoes of that, certainly, in the arguments around Brexit.
Yes, and we should remember that the first major act restricting immigration, the Aliens Act, had been passed in 1905. There's really quite a powerful anti-immigrant mood in British politics at this time, mostly concerned with migration from Eastern Europe and Jewish migration. So it is a kind of live wire running through British politics. And it's used by both sides. So we also find tariff reformers running posters, which have very racialized images of Chinese dealers with diseased pigs that they're sort of killing and selling to Britain as free trade bacon. And this is what free trade gives you, is it gives you the slummy products of migrant labour.
It's the Wuhan wet market.
Right, very much so.
I want to talk about the Liberals now, but before I do, something that we have to discuss. So you talked about this is it's not a universal suffrage election by any means, but it is a mass franchise election, but it does not include women. So this is also the age of suffragism. I mean, it hasn't quite peaked, but certainly it's there drumming away in the background. Was it an issue in the election?
It's not a major issue, and that's partly because it's always very difficult to make women's suffrage an election issue, because that is the point at which women can't vote. It's present, of course, there is heckling at meetings and there are protests, but it never achieves the same kind of salience as free trade or Chinese slavery or indeed education reform. But I think it is important to say that although women can't vote in this election, women are hugely involved in the 1906 election. So all the parties are absolutely dependent on women for voluntary labour. So the 1884 Corrupt Practices Act had made it much harder for parties to pay for things like canvassing. So overwhelmingly, by 1900, that is done by women. There's an organisation attached to the Conservative Party called the Primrose League, which has about 1 million female members in this period. And at every election time, they go bicycling off across the country, putting up posters, handing out leaflets, doing the canvassing. But it's not just about party organisation. A question like free trade is very much a women's question, because who does the shopping in this period? Who actually manages the household budget and experiences price rises? It's women. So interestingly, if you look at election posters from 1906, they're very often directed to women. And they're encouraging women to say to their husbands and their sons, for the women of Britain, for the women and children of Britain, you must vote Liberal.
And the best known slogan of the election is Big Loaf, Little Loaf, which is, I think in the 20th century, in the sort of the era of Thatcher, that would have been called a housewife's slogan.
Yes, it's a brilliant stunt that the Liberals pull, that Liberal candidates all over the country are baking loaves of bread, and they'll come out with a big loaf of bread, which is what you can buy under free trade with a couple of pennies, and then this tiny little, probably rather black and mouldy loaf, which is what you'll be able to buy once foreign corn is taxed. And the question is, do you want the big loaf of free trade or the little loaf of tariffs? And all of that is explicitly targeted at women. So the parties in this period clearly assume that women have electoral power, because they spend a lot of time and money appealing to women.
So the Liberals, the leader was Campbell-Bannerman, who in some ways is the forgotten prime minister in the sense that he wins an absolutely thumping victory. The great Liberal triumph in the age of mass mobilization, democracy. And prime ministers who win victories like that tend to be remembered: Attlee, Thatcher, Blair. Now, part of the reason that he isn't remembered is that he dies a couple of years into his administration. He has to stand down because of ill health. But when he dies, I've read some of the eulogies, and they say this is the passing of the other great Liberal statesmen of our time. It's Gladstone and Campbell-Bannerman, because he's still existing in the glow of this extraordinary triumph. And yet I think it's fair to say almost no one hears his name mentioned now, not in the way that even Gladstone and Disraeli are mentioned. So we should try and flesh him out a bit. He's a pretty interesting figure. What kind of a leader was he? The Liberals, as you say, Balfour had hoped might split if you can shove this guy into 10 Downing Street. And I think there was some feeling that maybe there were powers behind the throne. And he was quite old by this point. He was in his late 60s. There were some young men up and coming, not that young, to be honest, but younger men, Asquith and Lloyd George and others. Was he a kind of all things to all people politician? Was part of his success here actually that you could fill in the Campbell-Bannerman image to suit what you wanted in the way that you couldn't with someone like Joe Chamberlain, who very much, he was what he was? Was Campbell-Bannerman a clearly defined politician?
Well, in some ways he should have been, because he'd been around for a very long time. So he was 69 when he became prime minister, which I think makes him the oldest person to become prime minister for the first time. He had been a minister in Gladstone's governments, he'd been in Parliament for 40 years, but he was quite an unassuming character. He was quite easy to miss. He wasn't one of the charismatic figures of British politics, and he wasn't one of the ambitious figures of British politics either. He'd actually tried to become Speaker of the House of Commons a little bit earlier because he wasn't that up for the political battle. He'd become leader in 1898, partly because the Liberal Party had gone through so many leaders, it didn't really have anyone else left. And because of that, he was, I think, always underestimated by his opponents. And that's quite a valuable skill for a leader to have when people don't actually take you seriously. In fact, he was probably most famous for having accidentally triggered the fall of the last Liberal government. So in 1895, he was at the War Office. There was a scandal over the supply of cordite, which brought down the government, and he became known as Sir Henry Cordite-Bannerman. But in fact, he was a very respected man. He was very much loved by those around him, which is also an important political skill. He inspired loyalty in a party that was very factionalized. And he was a very good manager of more flamboyant and charismatic people, of whom there were many in the party. If you're trying to manage a party that has Winston Churchill, David Lloyd George, Asquith, having someone who's quite a good party manager and is probably not going to be there for very much longer can be quite a good combination. But there had actually been an attempt to get rid of him on the day that the Liberals took office. So 3 of his ministers, Asquith, Haldane and Grey, had agreed among themselves what was known as the Religious Compact, by which they would all refuse to serve under him, making his government impossible unless he went to the House of Lords and ceded power to Asquith, instead of which, showing that ruthlessness that a leader also needs, he went to the palace, formed a government, made Asquith his chancellor, and went on to win this spectacular election victory.
And one of the ways in which this is now modern politics, it had only been a decade earlier that you could be Prime Minister from the House of Lords. After all, Salisbury was the last Prime Minister from the House of Lords. I think by 1906, that's no longer, you shove someone into the House of Lords. It was always the case that you had to be in the Commons to be Chancellor, but not Prime Minister. But by this point, would it be fair to say it was understood? I mean, the great reform of the House of Lords hasn't happened yet, but shoving someone into the Lords is a way of sidelining them.
I think it could have been done. I think he could have been Prime Minister, but he would have been very much a figurehead Prime Minister by this stage in the Lords. It's worth saying, actually, he's also arguably the first person that we can accurately describe as the Prime Minister. So the formal title in the 19th century had been the First Lord of the Treasury. The term Prime Minister had been starting to come into use from the 1880s or so onwards. But actually, it's Campbell-Bannerman who is the first person who, in the official order of precedence at court, is described as the Prime Minister.
Wow, so he's the forgotten Prime Minister and he's the first Prime Minister.
Absolutely.
He was also a Scot. And one of the striking results in this election, I was just looking at the electoral map, is the Liberals completely cleaned up in Scotland. The Liberals won almost every seat in Scotland. The Conservative Party is the Unionist Party, but the Conservative Party is reduced, as it has been more recently at various points in its history, to being an English and in part Welsh, but English political party. So I've got a couple of questions here. So was that a significant shift? But the other thing that is different about this election is a traditional Conservative warning against putting the Liberals in, is that the Liberals will rely on Irish nationalists because it's hard for the Liberals to win a majority. They will rely on Irish nationalists, of whom there were about 70 in the Commons, in order to govern, again, with parallels to now. So that argument that the Tories have used very successfully, I think, over the last decade and a bit, which is to say to the voters, if you put, to take an example, Ed Miliband in Downing Street, he will be in the pocket of Alex Salmond or Nicola Sturgeon. That version, that poster, which was very successful. It's going to be very hard for this party to win a majority because it's stacked against them. So they're going to be reliant on nationalists, and then you will get deals and compromises, and in the end, you will compromise the union. And what you get in this election is a Liberal Party that is not invulnerable, but certainly not vulnerable as it has been in the past to that charge, because it becomes a majority party. Actually, as Labour now is not, no one's talking in this election about the possibility, and by this election I mean 2024, about the possibility of Labour being propped up by the Scott Nats, because we know they're going to win a majority. Now, people didn't know the Liberals were going to win a majority then, but this election is interesting for diffusing that charge, which was a really potent charge, I think, against liberalism because of the long fight over Home Rule over the preceding generation.
Yeah, so to take your first point about winning in Scotland, the Liberal Party since the 1880s had, to some extent, been driven back on Scotland and Wales as its heartlands. And in 1906, it absolutely maxes them out, and it squeezes every drop of electoral juice out of Scotland and Wales. But what's remarkable is it also sweeps much of the south of England, and it sweeps much of the southeast of England, and it's winning in places where it hadn't won for decades. And actually, of course, that plants the seeds of future danger. Because the nature of a landslide often is that you win in places where you don't really have deep roots and where you're not expected to win and where you have very small majorities. So those seats are ripe to fall again with quite a small Conservative revival in future. On Irish Home Rule, yes, that is a really interesting point. So since the 1880s, the Liberal Party have been committed to Home Rule for Ireland, the idea that it would give Ireland its own parliament and its own government, and it would become self-governing in much the same way as Australia or New Zealand. And that had been absolutely central to the Conservative Party's electoral messaging, that we must save the Union, we mustn't allow this to happen. In 1906, though, as you say, that dog doesn't bark. And it's partly because the Liberals made clear that they weren't going to do that in this Parliament, and they were believed because they couldn't do it. So in this period, the House of Lords still had an absolute veto on legislation. The House of Lords had a massive Conservative majority and was clearly never going to allow Home Rule through. So in that respect, the Conservatives have been too successful. They'd erected a kind of force field around the Union, which you couldn't get past unless you were willing to take on the House of Lords and reform its powers. Now, in 1911, of course, that happens. Because of the budget crisis, the Liberals do have to take on the Lords. They abolish its veto, and suddenly the shield generator is down, and the Liberals can legislate on Ireland, and indeed have to legislate on Ireland because they need Irish support. But in 1906, it's just not within the realms of political possibility.
So in some ways, this is the first modern election and the first modern campaign, but there are many things that we're used to that didn't happen back then. So one is polling, right? I think there was none that we would recognize. People put their finger up, licked it in the wind, and got a sense of which way. You're looking slightly skeptical. Go on, give me what?
Well, just to say, so you're absolutely right. There's no polling, but what you do have are a much larger number of by-elections. So partly because you have an older political class that's much more likely to die, and partly because people go off to do other jobs, by-elections are much more frequent. And so what you can do is you can see the tide of by-elections moving against the government. And that had been happening radically over the 1900 to 1906 period. So in that sense, people do know which way the wind is blowing.
Because that was going to be my question. There are some landslides which are foregone conclusions. I think 1997 was one. I think 1983 was one. 1945 came as a shock to many people. Was 1906 a shock? The scale of it?
I think the scale of it was a surprise. I don't think it was a surprise that the Liberals won. But we have to remember, the Liberals hadn't won a really good majority since 1880. So it's a quarter of a century. It's beyond the memory of many voters that the Liberals win at scale. So that's one reason, I think, why people were cautious. Another was that I think nowadays we often assume that when a party wins a landslide, it's going to take several elections to run that down. Perversely, we have a sense that landslides are quite stable. And yet actually the metaphor of a landslide is when the ground is moving and everything's slipping and sliding and you can't catch your feet. So historically, landslides are often followed by other landslides or other great political shocks. So there's a sense in this period that, the tectonic plates of politics are moving. There's a new electorate coming through that you don't understand very well. There are new issues emerging that parties are still trying to find their feet on. And that also makes it quite hard to predict how people are going to behave.
And did you get that thing that you do often get with landslides, and I think may be going to be the case in a couple of weeks, that a bunch of people wind up in the Commons that no one was expecting to wind up in a Commons? When you go down the party lists to seats that aren't the Liberals, then Labour now, aren't expected to be winnable, and suddenly they drop into the other column. It happened with the SNP in Scotland. That SNP election in 2015, when 56 SNP MPs showed up in the Commons, quite a few of them were very, very surprised to be there, and so were the party leaders surprised to find these people in the House of Commons. And you could say this is democracy in action. This is how it should work. Some people wind up in the House of Commons who aren't in politics to be in the House of Commons. Was there any of that this time, a sense that you got a different kind of person as an MP because seats were being won that weren't thought to be winnable?
Yes, there's always that wonderful moment on election night where you see the winner looking absolutely horrified at the realisation that they are now a member of Parliament. Yes, that did happen in 1906, and it happened partly because there were some utterly unexpected defeats. So for the Conservative Party, this isn't so much an election as an exorcism. It is a driving out of an entire governing elite. So the former Prime Minister, Balfour, loses his seat. I think 7 cabinet ministers lose their seats. So there is this, seats that the party had assumed were absolutely safe, that didn't particularly need electoral attention, are falling into the laps of the Liberal or occasionally the Labour Party.
I don't want to belabor the parallels with now, but exorcism is quite a good word. People keep talking about what's going to be the Portillo moment in 2024. We all remember it. And actually, one of the people, I don't think he was horrified, but the man who beat Portillo, Stephen Twigg, I remember that grin that he had on the night. I don't think it was a grin that he didn't want to be in the House of Commons, but it was a grin of someone who realised they'd won a seat that they would not be able to hold. That this political career was going to be in and out of Parliament. But the Portillo moment was symbolic because it was right on the edge of what people thought was possible. But you do get elections, like you say, where there's an actual cull. And we may be on the cusp of one of these. We haven't had one of these, actually, for a long time, where a governing class, a governing elite are just expelled from the body politic. And we are, back then in 1906, there was a brief interlude, but it was essentially 20 years of Tory rule. Well, what are we now? 15 years. It's a generation of politics and politicians. And when the public turns on this scale, it looks different from other kinds of landslides. It's exorcism's a good word for it. I haven't heard anyone talk about 2024 as an exorcism, but it's got that feel to it.
Well, of course, for us, one of the excitements of watching an election night are those moments when you see seats falling. Now, you don't get that, of course, in 1906, but you do get something else that's quite exciting, which is that before 1918, elections didn't all happen on the same day. So this election actually runs across 4 weeks. So results are building up cumulatively over time. So you get, I think, the first 50 or so seats is the first set of results. And there's this shock of, goodness, the Liberals are winning in places they never have before. And that builds momentum for the next set and then the next set. And then you have people who have perhaps lost their seats earlier in the campaign trying again later on. So you get this month long. It's more like a kind of European Championships or World Cup than just a single night of action.
And the thing that's thought to be absolutely beyond the pale now, which is that people should go to the polls knowing how other people have voted, that was baked in.
Absolutely. Yes, it's assumed. And to some extent, that's thought to be a good thing, that the country might, if it wishes, correct the results earlier on. It's also, of course, a function of the fact that in an age when you haven't got radio or TV and you haven't got fast communications, actually party leaders are having to travel around the country. So this is partly designed to allow them to go and campaign in one place and then move on to the next electoral battlefield.
So I want to ask a couple of questions about what follows from this election, because as you said at the beginning, for the Liberals, there are two ways of framing this. This is the great triumph, and it lays the groundwork for the great early 20th century reforming Liberal administration, not of Campbell-Bannerman, but of Asquith, with Lloyd George as his chancellor. And this is constitutional reform, but it's also the birth of the welfare state. On the other hand, this is the high watermark of liberalism, and the decline is coming, and it's coming quite soon. We're going to talk about it in the next episode. Like you say, landslides mean that the plates are shifting, and the ground hasn't just shifted under the Conservative Party here, it's shifting for the Liberal Party too. But in 1906, I think it's fair to say neither of these things were completely clear. So in 1906, well, I'm asking you, would it be possible to say this is going to be a great reforming administration? The pitch to the voters was as now, actually it's as Keir Starmer now, which is you've got to be kidding if you're going to put this lot in for another 5-6 years. It wasn't fixed then, but surely you're not going to give this lot another go. They've had a few turns now. It is our turn. And also, interestingly, I think the pitch was, as it is a little bit now implicitly, though they can't say it explicitly, they won last time on a single issue, Brexit, the Boer War. That is not the issue now. There are a whole range of questions. They pulled a fast one by sort of forcing the electorate into a single issue election. They're not going to get away with it this time. But I don't think it was an election in which the Liberal Party laid out a great reforming program. And as you say, the radical reformer in a way was Chamberlain. And yet within 5 years, this will be the great reforming government of its age. Could it be seen in 1906?
I think you would have had to have been a very prescient observer in 1906 to envisage that this would be a great social reforming government, because that simply isn't what anyone's talking about at the election. They're talking about free trade. They're talking about cutting taxes. One of the reasons why the Tories were so unpopular was because they had doubled income tax because of the costs of the Boer War. So it's very much a traditional Liberal pitch. It's about peace, retrenchment, economy, and free trade. But I think a prescient observer might have seen that change was coming, because there were things happening that were driving social reform up the agenda. So one of them was simply a growth in the kind of scientific study of poverty. So we get people like Charles Booth writing his life and labour of the people in London. And we get Seaborn Rowntree, who publishes a study of poverty in York. And they're producing, with a degree of statistical precision that's quite new, evidence that about 30% of the population is living in poverty, that about 10% of the population simply do not earn enough money to live a basically physically efficient life. And that means that you have to start thinking about poverty as a social problem with social causes and social treatments, rather than simply as individuals failing to fulfill their potential in life. But secondly, there's actually a growing imperial case for social reform. So during the Boer War, enormous numbers of people had volunteered to go and fight, only for 1 in 5 of them to fail the army medical. In some of the big northern cities, it's 60, 70% of all recruits who are simply medically incapable of fighting. Now, that's probably a misleading statistic because it tends to be the unemployed who volunteer to go and fight. But it really sends a shiver down the imperial spine. Because if your population is too weak and malnourished to hold a rifle, then how on earth are you going to cope with the great wars of the 20th century if you find yourself facing the German army or you find yourself at war with the United States? So what starts to happen in about 1905, 1906 is that the kind of people who publish earnest books on things like urban reform or nutrition are now giving them titles like The Heart of the Empire. And what they're doing is saying, you don't have to be a bleeding heart philanthropist to care about poverty. You've got to be a soldier and an imperialist, because if we don't fix this problem, then the British Empire is doomed.
And out of that, you get the deeply ironic, in this respect, career of David Lloyd George. So Lloyd George is the great anti-war, anti-Boer War representative of liberal opinion. He's, I think, nearly lynched at some point in about 1901, protesting against the war. You know, he's not in favour of shipping working men out there and putting a rifle in their hands. Nonetheless, he's the person who's going to become the vehicle through whom a lot of this social reform takes place. And then eventually as Prime Minister in the First World War, he's going to be the person who conscripts the British male population into the largest army that the country has ever seen. I mean, it's an extraordinary arc to that career from anti-war to social reformer to, as Prime Minister, the mass mobilizer, not of democracy, but of the military power of the British working man.
Yes, I mean, Lloyd George's career is a wild ride from start to finish. This is someone who starts off as a real class warrior, actually, in Wales, and the speeches that he makes in 1909 against the House of Lords are, hair-raising even for his liberal allies. And yet he ends up in the 1920s leading an overwhelmingly conservative government. But as Chancellor in the Liberal government, he's able to use this language of empire and language of national defence to make the case for reforms that he wants to carry for much more philanthropic purposes. He's also actually responding to a financial crisis in government, and this is another thing that your really clever observer in 1906 might have been watching, that the days in which a Liberal government led by Gladstone could run the country on about £60 million of tax were just coming to an end. And that's partly because of military competition. And there's a little historical irony that in February 1906, as the elections are going on, HMS Dreadnought is launched, which is the first of a new kind of warship, which is seen as rendering all existing battleships obsolete, which triggers a new naval race between Britain and Germany. And so the state is having to raise more money. A government that's come in wanting to cut taxes is actually finding it needs more money, and more money particularly for defence. And so it's having to rethink what's sometimes called the fiscal contract between government and citizens. It's taking more of their money. So what is it giving them in return? So the argument for giving people free school meals, maternity benefit, unemployment insurance, as a part of a package which also includes dreadnoughts and battleships and bigger guns, but also becomes important to the new Liberal project.
As you said, one of the reasons that the Liberals were able to diffuse the Irish nationalism question was more or less by saying, look, the House of Lords are going to block it anyway. There's nothing we can do about that. But here's another irony that maybe a smart observer in 1906 would have intuited, which is this was going to be not under Campbell-Bannerman, but Asquith succeeds him after a couple of years. Lloyd George becomes Chancellor. The People's Budget is blocked in the House of Lords. And for the next election, this becomes one of the central issues, which is, are we going to allow the House of Lords to stymie the will of the Commons? And the Liberals win that battle. It takes 2 elections to win it, but they win it. I mean, that fight doesn't come from nowhere. It's been rumbling for a long time. But it's not there in 1906. Like you say, the House of Lords is almost useful in a way that it often is in elections, not specifically the House of Lords, but what you might call the old constitution, to neutralize certain questions that might frighten the electorate if they're electing a government that has potential in it for more radical measures. And yet, it's just a few years later that this becomes the cause of liberalism. We have got to defeat the veto power of the House of Lords. Would that ideal smart observer of 1906 have seen that coming?
Possibly. So A.J. Balfour made an extremely foolish speech in 1905, as he was occasionally prone to do, in which he promised that the Conservative Party would command the destinies of this great empire, whether in power or out of power. And what he meant by that was if they lost the election, well, they would simply use their crashing majority in the House of Lords to continue governing the country. And in some ways, that did the Liberals a favour, because what the House of Lords proceeded to do over the next 3 years was to destroy their legislative agenda. So the Liberals kept trying to legislate on things like pub licensing, which they cared about very much, reforming the education system in order to diminish the importance of church schools, none of these great rabble-rousing issues, and the House of Lords simply threw it all in the dustbin. So by 1908, the Liberals were listing badly because they didn't really seem to have achieved anything. And one of the reasons why they stumble on social reform is that the House of Lords doesn't dare veto that. They find an area of policy that the House of Lords will actually let through. So in a way, they accelerate the Liberals' development into a welfarist party. And then famously in 1909, they very foolishly reject the Liberals' budget, the first time in centuries that the House of Lords had vetoed a budget. And that means that for the second time in a row, the Liberals can go to the country on a great Liberal cry. In 1906, it was free trade. This time, it is the peers versus the people. Who do you want to govern this country? The lords in their ermine and their crowns, or the people's elected representatives? And so they fight this extraordinarily demotic campaign, well, actually twice in 1910, to curb the power of the peers.
And yet, compared to 1906, it doesn't work because the landslide doesn't last. And by 1910, the Liberals and the Tories are more or less neck and neck again. And a Liberal government in the Commons is going to depend once again on Irish nationalist support and so on. The weird thing, perhaps, from the way you've described it, is the Great Demotic campaign was nowhere near as successful as Campbell-Bannerman's much more cautious campaign. On the other hand, I don't think it is that surprising any more than it should be surprising now that Labour are going to win a thumping majority, because it's a campaign that more or less says, you cannot give this lot another go. That's the most effective kind of political campaigning. There was a division in the country by 1910 on that question. It wasn't the case that the electorate all sided with the Liberals on the question of whether or not to curb the power of the House of Lords.
So it's true that in 1910, the Liberals lose their majority. That crashing majority won in 1906 is gone. And in fact, after the December 1910 election, we have the unique phenomenon of the two big parties on exactly the same number of seats. So the Liberals and the Conservatives both have, I think, 272 seats. But the Conservatives are still a long way from power, because the other seats in Parliament are held by roughly 80 Irish nationalists, around 40 to 50, depending on who you count, Labour MPs. So the Progressive Alliance, as it's starting to be known, is still actually very securely in power after 1910. And that's why, sort of pushing a bit further into the future, in the years after 1910, we see the Conservative Party moving away from parliamentary opposition to a kind of paramilitary politics in which it's actually supplying weapons to paramilitaries in Northern Ireland and to some extent building its own military forces in Britain, because it doesn't see a route to success in the House of Commons.
So I think we should finish with that final question, which in some ways is the biggest question of all here, and we haven't talked about it yet, which is this is the election, 1906, where the Labour Party establishes more than just a foothold. I mean, a tiny foothold had been established in 1900, a couple of MPs. But the Labour Party gets 40 plus MPs into the House of Commons. And this is partly because there is an electoral pact with the Liberals. In various seats, they don't stand against each other. And you've described it, not in formal terms, but there's a kind of progressive alliance here. But at the same time, what the Liberals were doing in ushering in those Labour MPs into the Commons in 1906 was opening the door to their nemesis, I mean, this is the party, the Tories aren't going to destroy the Liberal Party. The Labour Party are going to destroy the Liberal Party. And actually, we're going to talk about that when we talk about the election of 1924. So this is less than 2 decades ahead. The party that comes into the Commons in 1906 is going to replace the Liberals as the main party of opposition to the Conservatives, which they are to this day. So, this is the big change in British politics. That alliance or pact of 1906, it was a pact of convenience. Was it in any sense a pact also of principle? I mean, how deep did it run? These parties are pretty different. Keir Hardie and Campbell-Bannerman are not the same kind of politician at all.
They're not, but I think they're not that distant. And actually, quite a lot of leading figures in the Labour Party had tried to be elected as Liberals. So people like Ramsay MacDonald and Philip Snowdon and Arthur Henderson had actually tried to find Liberal seats in Parliament. And I think the Liberal Party nationally would rather like to have had them inside it. So the Gladstone-MacDonald Pact, as it's called, which is a secret pact that's agreed in 1904 when they don't know how the next election's going to turn out, is essentially a non-aggression pact in which the Liberals will stand down candidates in certain seats and give Labour a free run. And in particular, there are still a certain number of constituencies in this period that have 2 members of Parliament. So in those places, they will share it. You'll run one Liberal and one Labour candidate, and they can kind of come in together. And obviously that's great for the Labour Party because it gives them a foothold. But actually it's quite good for the Liberals as well, because Labour can win in places that they can't. And a lot of Liberals see it as a way of bringing into Parliament working class candidates who believe passionately in free trade, who are in many ways quite Gladstonian in their view of the world, who look like Liberals, but who they haven't been able to bring in themselves. And we've got to remember that in this period, members of Parliament aren't paid until 1911. They have to pay their own election expenses. So there are quite big structural obstacles to getting working classes in, unless you can attach them to a trade union movement that is willing to pay them. So there are lots of quite good reasons why Liberals think this is a good idea. But it's really striking, if you look back at retrospectives of the campaign that are written in 1906, so much of them are about the Labour Party. There are only 29 Labour MPs. This is about 4.5% of the House of Commons. And yet you would think they had sort of stormed the barricades. So there's a passage in the Edinburgh Review which says, "A cry of wonder went up from press and public. People wrote and spoke as if these members were the forerunners of a revolution, as if the old party divisions were completely worn out, as if power were about to pass to a new political party that would represent the masses as opposed to the classes." Because to some extent, the governing classes had been waiting for a working class party ever since they'd extended the franchise to working people in the 1860s. And here it is. So it's only small, but there's a sense this is potentially going to change the future of politics.
If you would like to get our next episode on the election of 1924, you need to subscribe to PPF Plus. To do that, just go to ppfideas.com or click on the link in the show description. You get bonus episodes, you get ad-free listening, you will get the election of 1924. Available now is our bonus to accompany the recent Great Political Fiction series, in which I try and answer some of your many questions about everything from the women in Dr. Jekyll's life to whether Ayn Rand is the presiding spirit on the current US Supreme Court. Just sign up to PPF Plus now to get all of that. Otherwise, the next episode you will hear in our regular slot on Thursday is about the election of 1945, the first great Labour landslide. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.